The day Louise Bell walked into the Harding County Courthouse alone, wearing her dead husband's wedding ring on a chain around her neck, because she could not afford a proper mourning brooch. Every man in that dusty Wyoming town expected her to fail. It was the autumn of 1878, and the air in Caldwell Creek carried the particular smell of dried grass and impending cold that always made the horses restless. The cottonwood trees along the main road had gone yellow and brittle, and the sky above the Wyoming plains was that enormous, indifferent blue that made a person feel both free and terribly small at the same time. Louise Bell was 31 years old, with 2 children, a mortgaged ranch, and a grief so fresh it still woke her up before dawn every morning expecting to find her husband Thomas beside her in the bed. Instead, she found the cold side of the mattress and the sound of her children breathing in the next room, and she would lie there in the dark and remind herself that she had to keep going because they needed her too. Thomas Bell had died 4 months earlier from a fever that came on fast and took him in 9 days. He was 34 years old and had been a decent man with calloused hands and a good laugh, and Louise had loved him the way you love something solid and dependable, the way you love a foundation wall. When he was gone, the whole structure of her life tilted dangerously, and she had spent the months since then trying to hold it upright through sheer determination. Her children were Clara, who was 9 years old and had her father's serious eyes and her mother's stubborn jaw, and Henry, who was 7 and still cried for his father sometimes when he thought his mother could not hear him. Louise heard him every time. She pressed her face into her pillow and let her own tears go quietly so that neither of her children would feel the full weight of what had happened to their family. The trouble with Judge Alderman Holt had started 3 weeks after Thomas died, when his brother Clarence Bell rode out to the ranch and informed Louise that Thomas had borrowed $700 from him 6 years prior, and that he expected repayment within 60 days, or he would take the children to raise himself, as was, he claimed, Thomas's expressed wish should anything happen to him. Louise had never heard of any such loan, and she had certainly never heard of any such agreement regarding the children. She asked Clarence to produce the written record of the loan, and he produced a piece of paper that looked to her eyes suspicious in its freshness and its remarkable clarity, as though the ink had not had 6 years to fade. She had gone to see the county lawyer, a man named Preston Aldrich who smelled of tobacco, and who looked at her with the particular brand of sympathy men reserved for women they did not intend to help. He told her the paper appeared legitimate and that Clarence Bell had standing to pursue the matter in court. He told her she would need representation and quoted her a fee that would have taken half the ranch's remaining cash reserve. She thanked him and walked out of his office and stood on the wooden sidewalk outside with the sun beating down on her black mourning dress and thought very carefully about what she was going to do next. What she was going to do next, she decided, was represent herself. She had been schooled through the 8th grade and had read every book that came through Caldwell Creek's small lending library, including 2 volumes of common law that she had requested specifically, because Thomas had always said a person who understood the law was a person who could not easily be cheated. She borrowed those volumes again now, and she read them by lamplight every night after the children were in bed, making notes in the margins of a composition book with a stub of pencil, teaching herself the language and the logic of the courtroom with the same methodical intensity she applied to everything she decided was worth doing. Micah Monroe had arrived in Caldwell Creek 6 weeks before the trial, riding in on a chestnut quarter horse with a bedroll tied behind his saddle, and a reputation that preceded him by about half a mile, depending on who was doing the talking. He was 34 years old, broad across the shoulders, with dark eyes that had seen more than their share of hard country, and a scar along his left jaw that he never explained to anyone who asked. He had spent the better part of the last decade working cattle drives from Texas up through Kansas and into Wyoming, and he was, by most accounts, one of the better ranch hands and trail riders in the territory. He was also, which was less commonly known, a man who had studied for 2 years at a law office in Austin before a combination of circumstance and restlessness had pulled him back to the open trail. He carried a copy of Blackstone's commentaries in his saddlebag, the way other men carried extra ammunition, and he read it on quiet nights the way other men played cards. He had taken a position at the Calhoun Ranch 3 miles outside of Caldwell Creek, hired on for the autumn work, and he had learned about Louise Bell's situation the same way everyone learned about everything in a town of 400 people, which was through the accumulated whisper of the general store and the post office and the barber shop. He had heard Clarence Bell described as a man of means and standing. He had heard Louise Bell described as a brave fool who was going to walk into that courtroom and have her children taken from her by noon. He had not intended to involve himself. He had learned over the years that involving himself in other people's troubles was a reliable path to collecting new troubles of his own, and he had enough of those already. He told himself this firmly on the morning of the trial as he ate his breakfast at the boarding house table and watched the other ranch hands talk about the Bell widow, and whether she had any realistic chance, and whether Clarence Bell was the kind of man who would actually raise 2 children or whether he just wanted the ranch land. The trial was open to the public, as all proceedings in Harding County Courthouse were, and that courthouse was the largest building in Caldwell Creek aside from the livery stable, a proud 2-story structure of pale sandstone with a carved eagle above the door that had lost one of its wings to a lightning strike 2 summers past. By the time the morning session was called to order, the gallery benches were filled with townspeople who had come partly out of genuine concern for Louise Bell and partly out of the timeless human appetite for watching conflict play out in a formal setting. Louise sat at the plaintiff's table alone. She had on her best dress, which was a dark blue wool that she had let out at the seams herself because she had lost weight since Thomas died. Her hair was pinned up neatly under a small hat with a single gray feather, and she sat with her back very straight and her hands flat on the table in front of her, and her composition book open to the first page of her notes. She did not look frightened. She looked like a woman who had made her peace with fear and decided to proceed anyway, which was, in its own way, more difficult and more impressive than simply being unafraid. Clarence Bell sat at the opposite table with Preston Aldrich beside him, and Aldrich had on his good suit and his confident expression, and Clarence looked satisfied in the way of men who believe the outcome has already been decided and are simply waiting for the formality of it to conclude. Judge Richard Pemberton presided. He was a fair man, as judges in the territory went, though fair in 1878 Wyoming meant something more limited than it might in other times and places. He had a gray mustache and a careful manner, and he ran his courtroom with the measured authority of a man who understood that order was more fragile than it appeared and required constant maintenance. Micah had slipped into the back of the gallery 20 minutes before the session began, telling himself he was only curious, telling himself he would leave after the opening statements if it looked like she had any kind of handle on the situation. He had watched Louise Bell take her seat at that table alone, and something in his chest had tightened in a way he did not entirely understand and did not particularly welcome. He had seen men stand alone against unfavorable odds many times in his life, and he had a certain appreciation for that kind of nerve. But watching a woman in a black-edged morning dress sit down alone at a table in a courtroom where the deck was very clearly stacked against her, with her composition book and her pencil stub and her spine as straight as a fence rail, he felt something more than appreciation. He felt something that moved in him like a slow fire, and he sat very still in the back of the gallery and watched, and did not yet know what he intended to do with it. The proceedings opened with Aldrich presenting the claim on behalf of Clarence Bell, and Aldrich was polished and smooth and thoroughly professional about it. He presented the document of the loan. He presented two witnesses who claimed to have known of the arrangement between Thomas and Clarence, and he presented what he described as a letter, written in Thomas Bell's own hand, expressing his wish that his children be raised by his brother should he die. The letter was dated 2 years prior. Louise sat through all of this with her pencil moving steadily across her composition book. She wrote down every word that was said. She wrote down the names of the witnesses, and the dates they referenced, and the specific language Aldrich used when describing the loan. She was building something in that composition book, and Micah, watching her from the back of the room, could see it even if no one else could. She was not flailing, she was working. When it came time for Louise to respond, she stood up and the whole gallery went very quiet. Judge Pemberton looked at her over his spectacles with an expression that was not unkind but was clearly uncertain. "Mrs. Bell," he said, "are you certain you wish to proceed without counsel?" "I am, Your Honor," she said, and her voice was steady and clear and carried to the back of the room without difficulty. "I would ask the court's patience with a woman who is learning as she goes." There was a murmur in the gallery. Pemberton quieted it with a look. Louise began. She was not polished the way Aldrich was polished, but she was something better than polished. She was precise. She had read those law books and she had paid attention, and she knew which questions to ask, even if she did not always know exactly how to phrase them in legal language. She asked the first witness, a man named Gerald Torp, to describe the specific circumstances under which he had allegedly witnessed the loan agreement. Torp got vague. She asked him again, more specifically, and he got vaguer. She consulted her composition book and pointed out that the date he had given for witnessing the agreement placed him, according to the Caldwell Creek Post Office records she had obtained and brought with her, in Laramie on that particular weekend. She produced the postal records. The gallery shifted. She asked the second witness, a man named Dobbs, similar questions, and Dobbs held up better but not perfectly, and Louise noted two inconsistencies in his testimony and marked them clearly in her book, and stated them aloud for the record with the calm, measured tone of a woman who has been up until midnight every night for 3 weeks preparing for exactly this moment. And then she came to the letter. This was where it got harder. She had no obvious counter to the letter. She had spent 3 weeks trying to find one and had not found it cleanly enough to be certain. She could challenge the handwriting, but she had no expert to verify her challenge. She could challenge the circumstances of its creation, but she had no witnesses. What she did have was Thomas Bell's character, and she knew that character better than anyone alive, and she was going to have to make the court feel it. She was in the middle of speaking about Thomas Bell, about the kind of man he had been, and the specific ways in which the letter's language did not match his way of expressing himself, when something happened that she had not anticipated. A voice from the back of the gallery said, "Your Honor, if it please the court, I would like to offer assistance." The whole room turned. Micah Monroe was standing up. He had not planned to stand up. He was standing up anyway, the way a person sometimes acts before they have fully reasoned through the action, operating on something deeper and older than logic. He was holding his hat in both hands and he was looking at Judge Pemberton, and his expression was serious and respectful. Judge Pemberton looked at him with the professional wariness of a man who has encountered most varieties of courtroom disruption. "And who are you, sir?" "Micah Monroe, Your Honor. I'm employed at the Calhoun Ranch outside of town. I have some background in law and I believe I can be of assistance to Mrs. Bell, if she'll permit it, and if the court will allow me to approach." There was a long moment. Pemberton looked at Louise. Louise was looking at Micah Monroe with an expression that was complex and difficult to read, because it contained surprise and wariness and something that was, underneath both of those things, desperately grateful, though she would not have admitted the desperate part to anyone, least of all herself. "Mrs. Bell," Pemberton said, "are you amenable to this?" Louise looked at the man standing in the back of the gallery. He was tall and dark-eyed, and he had the steady, unhurried look of someone who was not easily rattled, and he was holding his hat with both hands like a person who understands courtesy. She did not know him. She did not know his motives. She had been managing on her own for 4 months, and she had gotten very accustomed to trusting no one but herself, because trusting people was a vulnerability, and she could not afford vulnerabilities right now. But she was also a practical woman, and practicality told her that she was struggling with the letter, and that struggling with the letter was going to cost her this case, and that losing this case was going to cost her Clara and Henry. "I am amenable," she said. Micah Monroe walked down the center aisle of the Harding County Courthouse and took the empty chair at Louise Bell's table, and as he sat down he said quietly, without looking at her, "The letter. I know how to challenge it. Tell me what you observed about the ink when you examined it." She turned her head and looked at him. He was close enough that she could see the details of his face, the lines of it, the careful attention in his dark eyes. He was looking at the papers on the table, reading quickly, absorbing information with the focused efficiency of someone accustomed to processing things fast. "The ink was too fresh," she said, keeping her voice low. "No fading, no foxing at the edges of the paper. Nothing consistent with 2 years of storage." "Exactly right," he said. "Do you know if the paper has a watermark?" She blinked. "I didn't think to look." Most paper mills began adding regional watermarks to their stock in the early 1870s, he said. "If that paper has a watermark from a mill that only began producing paper after the supposed date of the letter, the date is impossible." He looked at her then directly, for the first time. "Does Aldrich have the original document or a copy?" "The original is with the clerk," she said. "Then we ask the judge to examine the original," he said, "and we ask for a brief recess to examine the watermark." He was already writing something in her composition book, using her pencil, and she watched his handwriting move quickly across the page, precise and economical, and something about the sight of him writing in her book with her pencil felt more intimate than it had any right to feel in the middle of a courtroom crisis. What followed was one of the more dramatic afternoons in Harding County Courthouse history, which was saying something given the general character of the territory. Micah requested the recess through Louise, who was technically still representing herself, and Pemberton granted it with some reluctance. During the recess, Micah examined the original letter carefully and found the watermark, a small pressed mark in the lower corner of the paper that identified the manufacturer as the Holt Davies Mill of Denver, Colorado. He then produced from memory, with the kind of calm certainty that made Aldrich look genuinely alarmed for the first time, the fact that the Holt Davies Mill had not begun operations until the spring of 1876, a full year after the date on the letter. When they returned to session, and Micah laid out this argument, requesting that the court verify the watermark information through correspondence with the mill if necessary, the whole room went through that particular quality of silence that only occurs when something irrefutable has been said. Judge Pemberton examined the mark himself. Pemberton sent his bailiff to find the town's postmaster, who had previously done business with the Holt Davies Mill and could confirm the mill's founding date from memory. The postmaster confirmed it without hesitation. The mill had opened in the spring of 1876. The letter dated 1875 had been written on paper that did not exist in 1875. Aldrich attempted to recover. He was not without skill and he was not without nerve, and he spent 20 minutes trying to find an explanation that would hold water, but none of his explanations held water, and Louise sat beside Micah Monroe at that table and watched the case collapse across the room with a feeling she would only be able to describe later, to herself, in the privacy of her own mind, as the particular sensation of a foundation wall that had been tilting for months suddenly being pushed back upright. Judge Pemberton ruled against Clarence Bell's claim on the children, finding insufficient evidence of any legitimate custodial agreement, and finding the primary supporting document, being the letter, to have been created after the stated date. He also noted serious questions about the loan document's validity and recommended further examination. a recommendation that would eventually lead to Clarence Bell's complete and humiliating exit from Harding County. But that was a story that would unfold over subsequent weeks. The gavel came down and the gallery erupted, and Louise stood up from her chair, and for a moment she simply stood there, and she pressed both hands flat against the tabletop and breathed, because she needed to breathe before she could do anything else. Clara and Henry were with Mrs. Odom, the neighbor who had watched them during the trial, and they were safe, and they were going to stay safe, and the ranch was hers, and everything was going to be all right. She was not going to cry in a courtroom. She had already decided that. She turned to the man beside her. Micah Monroe was gathering the papers from the table, stacking them neatly, and when he looked up and found her looking at him, he stopped what he was doing. "Thank you," she said. The two words were completely inadequate, and they both knew it, and she could feel that inadequacy in her voice, and she did not know how to bridge it. He looked at her for a moment. "You had it mostly done yourself," he said. "You had taken apart 2 of their 3 supports before I stood up. The letter was the hard part." "The letter would have been the end of it," she said. "Without you knowing about the watermark, I would have lost." He did not argue with that because it was true, and he was not the kind of man who made a habit of dishonest reassurance. "I'm glad I knew about it," he said simply. She studied him for a moment with those direct, serious eyes that he was already beginning to find remarkable, the eyes of a person who paid close attention to everything and pretended to pay attention to nothing. "Why did you stand up?" she said. "You didn't know me. You had no obligation." He was quiet for a beat. Around them the gallery was emptying, people flowing out into the afternoon sunlight, and the noise of their conversation rose and fell, and the room began to open up. And still he was quiet, as though he was considering the question with genuine seriousness, rather than offering an automatic answer. "Because it was the right thing to do," he said. "And because watching you sit there alone at that table was about the bravest thing I'd seen in a long time, and I've seen some brave things." She looked at him for another moment, and something in her expression shifted, very subtly, in a way she was probably not even aware of, the way a person's face changes when they register something that reaches them more deeply than they expected. Then she picked up her composition book and her hat, and she said, "I don't know your first name." "Micah," he said. "Louise Bell," she said, and she offered her hand, which was not common between men and women in 1878 Wyoming, but Louise Bell had never been tremendously interested in what was common when what was common seemed less logical than the alternative. He shook her hand. Her grip was firm and her hand was calloused from ranch work, and she met his eyes when she did it, and he thought that Thomas Bell had been a very lucky man. The weeks that followed the trial were the kind that move in a particular rhythm, full of practical necessities that carry within them, quietly, the possibility of something else. Louise needed help with the ranch. The autumn work was falling behind, and she had been managing alone since Thomas died. And with the trial now settled and the immediate crisis past, she could afford to think about the longer-term problems that remained. The ranch was not going to run itself, and the mortgage was not going to pay itself, and the cattle needed bringing in before the first hard frost. Micah Monroe's employment at the Calhoun Ranch ended at the conclusion of the autumn work, as it had always been intended to, and he found himself in the interesting position of being available, and of knowing that a particular ranch 3 miles from town was in need of a capable hand. He told himself he was thinking about this purely as an employment matter. He was not entirely convincing himself of this, but he maintained the pretense for about 3 days before he rode out to the Bell Ranch on a Tuesday morning with his hat in his hand and his chestnut horse tied at the post. Louise answered the door with flour on her hands, because she had been making bread, and she looked at him with that careful, considering expression he was already learning to recognize as her default state before she decided whether to trust something. "Mr. Monroe," she said. "Micah," he said. "Micah," she said, and the word had a slightly different sound in it this time, slightly warmer, though he suspected she was not aware of that. "What brings you out this way?" "I finished up at Calhoun's last Friday," he said. I heard you might be needing someone to help bring in the cattle before the frost. I'm available. I'm a fair hand and I know cattle work and I won't charge you more than what's reasonable." She was quiet for a moment, and he could see her turning it over in her mind, checking it for complications the way she checked everything, thorough and methodical. He had the sense that she had become very careful about who she let close after Thomas died, the way people sometimes became when the thing they had built their security on had been taken away suddenly. He did not push. He stood on the porch with his hat and waited. "Come in," she said finally. "I'll put coffee on." The kitchen was warm from the bread and there was a good smell to it, wood smoke and yeast and something that was simply the specific domestic warmth of a house where children were raised and meals were made and life went on stubbornly despite everything. Clara was at the table doing her school lessons and she looked up at Micah with Thomas Bell's serious eyes and assessed him with the unsettling directness of a 9-year-old who has learned early that the world contains surprises and not all of them pleasant. "Are you the man from the courthouse?" she said. "I am," he said. "Mama said you helped," Clara said, and her tone was neutral in the way that meant she was reserving judgment. "Your mother did the most of it," he said. "I just knew one particular thing she didn't happen to know yet." Clara considered this. "Are you a lawyer?" "I know some law," he said. "Mostly I work cattle." "Papa worked cattle," Clara said, and returned to her lessons with the decisive air of someone who has gathered sufficient information for now but reserves the right to gather more later. Henry appeared from the back of the house then, trailing a piece of string and looking generally curious about the new person, because Henry at 7 was still in the phase of finding new people interesting rather than potentially threatening. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at Micah with big brown eyes. "Are you going to fix the fence?" Henry said. "Because the fence on the south side is broken, and Mama said she was going to fix it, but she said that 2 weeks ago." "Henry," Louise said from the stove, with the patient, slightly exhausted tone of a woman who is managing 2 children and a ranch and a grief, and has not fully slept in 4 months. "I can fix the fence," Micah said. "If your mother wants me to." Louise turned from the stove and looked at him and then at Henry and then at the cup of coffee she was pouring, and something in her face went through a brief softening before the practical expression came back. "We can talk terms," she said, and set the coffee in front of him and sat down across the table and they talked terms. The terms they settled on were fair. He would stay in the bunkhouse, which was small but serviceable, and take his meals in the main house, and he would receive a monthly wage that was honest for the work and did not pretend to be more or less than what it was. He began the following morning. The days had a quality to them that he had not experienced in a long time, a quality of purposefulness and placement, of being somewhere specific and needed rather than simply being between one stretch of trail and the next. He was up before dawn and the work was real, fencing and cattle, and the 100 small repairs that a ranch accumulates when it has been going short-handed for months. The frost held off barely, and he got the cattle brought in properly, and the south fence repaired, and the roof of the outbuilding patched before the first serious cold came. Louise worked as hard as he did. She was up as early as he was, sometimes earlier, and she did not give the impression of a woman waiting to be rescued or managed. She made decisions about the ranch the way she had made decisions in that courtroom, with careful attention and no wasted motion, and she was usually right, and when she was not right she adjusted without drama. He found this more attractive than he had anticipated finding it, though he kept that observation to himself, and maintained a respectful professional distance that he felt was appropriate given the circumstances. He found other things about her attractive, gradually, in the way that attraction builds when it is not announced or performed, but simply accumulates through proximity and attention. He found the way she listened attractive, the completeness of her attention when someone was speaking to her. He found the specific way she was patient with Henry and firm with Clara, and how she calibrated each child differently according to what they needed. He found the way she laughed, On the rare occasions she allowed herself to laugh, which was suddenly and fully and then somewhat self-consciously, as though she had not quite given herself permission to be that light yet. He found himself looking for occasions to make her laugh. One evening in early November he had been fixing a lantern on the porch, and she had come out to check on something and stayed to watch him work, and they had talked for an hour, just talked, about the territory and about the weather and about the price of cattle and about books, and he mentioned Blackstone's commentaries, and she said she had never read Blackstone, but she had read the Wyoming territorial statutes twice through, and he looked at her, and said that was probably more immediately useful, and she smiled at that. And the smile was different from the polite, controlled expressions she usually wore. It was genuine and a little unguarded, and it reached her eyes, and standing there on the cold porch with the lantern in his hands, he thought he was in some degree of trouble. The first time she called him by his first name without a slight formality, and it was in November, when Henry fell off the fence he had been explicitly told not to climb and came into the house crying with a scraped knee and a bruised pride, and Louise was in the middle of cleaning the scrape and saying the calm, practical things mothers say, and Micah came in from outside and saw what had happened and crouched down to Henry's level and said very seriously, "That fence has it out for me too. I've banged my knee on that post twice this week." Henry looked at him with wet eyes. "You have," he said. "Twice," Micah confirmed. "Once in the morning and once in the afternoon, just to make sure I remembered." Henry laughed, a wet, hiccuping laugh, and Louise looked across her son's head at Micah and said, "Thank you, Micah." And there was no formality in it at all, just warmth, and the warmth in it went through him like the first fire of the season, welcome and necessary. Clara remained more cautious. She was 9 years old, and she had her father's serious temperament, and she was not going to give her good opinion of anyone quickly. Micah did not push. He talked to her when she came to him and left her alone when she didn't, and he always spoke to her like a person rather than a child, which was, in his experience, what most children actually wanted. He answered her questions about law with real answers, and he talked to her about cattle with genuine respect for her intelligence. And gradually, over the weeks, the serious eyes became slightly less guarded. The evening she showed him her own composition book, in which she had been keeping notes about plants and animals she had observed on the ranch, and asked him in a very small, careful voice whether he thought it was a good idea. He looked at it for a long time with honest attention and said, "I think this is a remarkable document, and I think you should keep it the rest of your life." And Clara looked at him for a moment and then looked at her book and said, "Papa used to say something like that." There was a silence between them that was heavy and tender simultaneously, and Micah said, "He sounds like he was a smart man," and Clara said, "He was," and closed the book, and that was all, but something shifted after that, something eased. December came, and the cold came with it for real, and the Wyoming winter settled over the Bell Ranch like a patient thing that intended to stay for a while. The evenings grew long, and the four of them spent more time in the kitchen around the wood stove, Micah reading or helping Henry with sums, Louise sewing or writing letters, Clara doing her lessons or her composition book, and the domesticity of it had a particular kind of sweetness that none of them talked about but all of them felt, each in their own way. Louise felt it most, and it frightened her most. She had not expected to feel this way again so soon. She had not given herself permission to feel this way again at all, not yet, maybe not for years. She carried Thomas's ring on the chain around her neck, and she still thought about him every day, the solid, dependable fact of him, the loss of him, and she thought that feeling anything for another man was a kind of betrayal, even though the rational part of her knew that was not how love worked, that love was not a finite resource that diminished when it was extended. She pushed the feeling away when it came, firmly, the way she pushed away all the things she could not afford right now. She remained warm but professional with Micah Monroe. She remained appreciative but contained, and she thought she was managing this well until the evening he came in from outside with the first real snowfall on his shoulders, and she handed him a cup of coffee and their hands touched around the cup, and she held the warmth of that accidental contact for longer than she should have and knew, in the particular way of self-knowledge that cannot be argued with, that she was not managing it as well as she thought. He knew too. He knew with the same certainty, and he was being equally careful, because she was 4 months a widow and her children were watching, and her grief was real, and her independence was real, and the last thing he wanted to do was make her feel crowded or pressured when she had only just gotten her footing back. He thought about her at odd moments during the day, when he was not intending to, when he was checking cattle or mending wire or lying in the narrow bunk in the bunkhouse looking at the ceiling of a cold night. He thought about the sound of her voice and the way she moved through the work of her days with that particular combination of strength and grace, and he thought about what it would be like to be the kind of person she came home to rather than the person who worked her land and slept in her bunkhouse and quietly, carefully held himself to a professional distance. Christmas came to Caldwell Creek with a modest festivity. The town put a tree in front of the general store, and there was a community supper at the church, and the children received small gifts, and the adults exchanged pleasantries, and a general goodwill settled over the territory for a few days that made the enormous cold sky feel slightly less indifferent. Louise and Micah and the children attended the church supper together, because the ranch was 3 miles from town, and the practical matter of getting there made it sensible, and they sat together at the long table with the rest of the town and ate the communal food, and it was the first time Louise had been somewhere social since Thomas died that did not feel entirely like an ordeal. She caught herself, somewhere in the middle of the meal, laughing at something Micah said, a real laugh, the kind she had been rationing, and she let herself have it, and the children were laughing too, and the warmth of the church and the food and the sound of her children's laughter settled into her like something healing. On the way home in the wagon, with the children asleep under a blanket in the back and the stars enormous above the plains and their breath making small clouds in the cold air, she said to him, "I don't know how to thank you for what you've done here." He looked at the horses and the dark road. "I told you before, you don't need to thank me. You came here when you could have gone anywhere," she said. "You stood up in that courtroom when you had no reason to. You fixed the fence and brought in the cattle, and you talked to my children like they were worth talking to, and you have been nothing but decent every single day since you arrived." She paused. "I know it's proper to just accept all of that and be grateful and not say too much, but I wanted you to know that I see it, that I see you." There was a silence between them, and the wagon moved slowly through the cold dark, and the stars burned overhead, and the children breathed in the back of the wagon. "Louise," he said, and the way he said her name had something in it that had not been there before, something direct and careful at once, the way he seemed to do most things. "I'm here because I want to be. That's the only reason there is, and wherever else I go after this, I'm going to think about this place for a long time." She said nothing, but she heard the "wherever else I go" in it, the implication of impermanence, and she felt something contract in her chest at the thought of it. She said nothing about that either. January in Wyoming was brutal and straightforward about it, with no pretense. The snow came in earnest, and the temperature dropped to a kind of cold that was not merely unpleasant but actively hostile, and managing a ranch in that weather required a constant attention to detail that left little room for anything except the practical. Water troughs froze and had to be broken twice a day. The cattle had to be checked and fed and kept out of the worst weather. The woodpile required continuous replenishment, and Micah and Louise worked side by side through all of it with the particular ease of two people who have developed a working rhythm, who have learned each other's pace and method, and no longer need to negotiate every task. One morning in the second week of January, when the cold had come down so hard that even the horses were reluctant to move, Louise slipped on the ice near the water trough and went down sharply on her side and lay there for a moment, winded, in the snow. Micah was across the yard, and he was at her side in a matter of seconds, crouching in the snow beside her, his hand on her shoulder. "Are you hurt?" he said, and his voice was different from his usual measured tone, faster and lower, with something in it that was unmistakably fear. "I'm all right," she said. "Only my dignity. Can you sit up?" I said I'm all right, she said, but she was breathing carefully in the particular way of someone who has taken a hard knock and is assessing the damage, and he kept his hand on her shoulder until she had established that nothing was broken and she could stand. And then he helped her up, and she stood in the snow with his hand still on her arm, and she looked at him. His face was very close, and it was genuinely worried, and she saw in it the clear, uncomplicated fact of how much he cared what happened to her, not as an employee looking after a situation, but as a person who was specifically and fully concerned with her. She saw it plainly, and he did not look away, and they stood in the January cold and the snow and looked at each other, and something that had been restrained for weeks stretched very thin and close to its limit. "Micah," she said. "You don't have to say anything," he said. "I know where things stand. I know the timing is not right, and I'm not asking for anything." "You didn't let me finish," she said, and there was something soft and direct in her tone that he had not heard before. "I was going to say that I think I'm very glad you're here, and that the thought of you leaving frightens me considerably more than it should, given how short a time I've known you." He was very still. The cold was immense around them, and the light was the flat white of a winter morning. "It's only been 4 months," he said carefully. "I know that," she said, "and I am still grieving Thomas. I want to be honest with you about that because I think you deserve honesty. I carry him with me, and I will for a long time." She touched the chain at her neck briefly. "But I have also been watching you for 4 months, and I am no longer confused about what I feel. I only wanted to say that. I'm not asking you to stay or to make promises. I just wanted to be honest with you." He looked at her for a long time in the cold morning light. "I've been trying very hard not to feel what I feel," he said, "because I didn't think the circumstances warranted me saying anything about it. But since you're being honest—" He stopped. He looked at her with those dark eyes that were steady and warm simultaneously. "I think you're the most remarkable person I've encountered in a very long time, and I think about this place every day when I'm out in the field, and not because of the land." The wind came across the yard and moved through the bare trees, and somewhere in the distance one of the cattle made a sound, and Louise Bell stood in the snow with Micah Monroe's hand still on her arm, and thought that grief and gladness were not, after all, incompatible. That you could carry something lost and something found at the same time, and that one did not diminish the other. She said, "Come in for breakfast when you're done with the trough. I'm making something hot." He smiled then, a real smile, and it changed his face entirely, opened it up, and she thought that it was very good that he did not smile that way constantly, because a person could become quite disoriented by it. The months that followed moved with the slow, deliberate pace of trust being built, carefully, honestly, by two people who both understood the value of what they were doing and did not want to rush it or waste it. They talked more in the evenings, not just practical conversation but the other kind, about their lives before Caldwell Creek, about what they had wanted and what had happened instead, about books and beliefs and the future of the territory. She told him about growing up in Ohio and coming west as a bride at 19, and the life she and Thomas had built year by year on this particular piece of Wyoming ground. He told her about his time in Austin and the law office and why he had left, which was a complicated story involving a case where the law had been applied unjustly and he had said so, and the senior partner had disagreed, and the professional relationship had become untenable, and he had gotten on his horse and ridden north and had been riding in one direction or another ever since. "You've been looking for somewhere to stop," she said. "I hadn't thought of it in those terms," he said. "But yes." "Do you think you found it?" she said. He looked at her across the table, across the lamplight, across the 4 months of mornings and evenings and conversations and silences and cold and work, and the gradual, irreversible accumulation of something that had no adequate name for its first 6 months. "I think I might have," he said. Spring came to the Bell Ranch as it always came to Wyoming, suddenly and urgently, as though making up for lost time. The frozen ground thawed to mud and then dried, and the grass came up green, and the cattle moved out onto the new pasture, and the cottonwoods along the creek put out their first leaves, and the sky went from the flat white of winter to the enormous extravagant blue of a Wyoming spring that made even people who had lived there all their lives stop what they were doing and look up. Clara had, by this point, given Micah her full and serious approval. This happened gradually and without announcement, as things did with Clara, until one afternoon she simply appeared beside him while he was repairing a section of fence and began helping him without being asked, handing him tools and holding the wire straight, and they worked together in comfortable silence for an hour. And when they were done, Clara looked at the repaired fence with her critical eyes and said, "That's a good job." And that was the official verdict, and he received it with appropriate gravity. Henry had been his enthusiastic partisan since approximately the second week, and had made this so plain and so consistently that it had become a running affectionate joke in the household. On an April evening when the air was finally warm enough to sit on the porch after supper, Micah sat beside Louise on the step and they watched the last of the sunset over the plains, and the children were inside doing their evening tasks, and the quiet between them was the comfortable kind, the kind that does not need to be filled. He said, "I'd like to talk to you about something." She turned to look at him. He had his hands on his knees and he was looking at the last light on the grass, and there was something in his posture that was slightly different from his usual ease, a slight tightening, and she recognized it as the posture of someone who is about to say something important and is trying to get it right. "I've been thinking about what I want," he said. "Not what's practical or what's customary or what the circumstances call for. What I actually want." He turned to look at her then. "I want to be here. Not as a ranch hand, though I'll do whatever work needs doing for as long as I'm alive and capable. I want to be here with you, properly, if that's something you want. And I understand if it isn't, or if it isn't yet." She looked at him for a moment. The last light was on his face, and his dark eyes were very serious and very direct, and she thought about all the mornings and evenings and conversations and silences, and the way he had stood up in a courtroom for her without being asked, and the way he spoke to her children, and the way he had looked at her in the snow that January morning with undisguised fear for her safety, and the way he had just said what he wanted plainly and honestly without manipulation or pressure. "It's something I want," she said. "I want it very much." He reached over and took her hand, and she let him, and they sat on the porch of the Bell Ranch in the April evening with the plains going dark in front of them, and held on to each other with the quiet certainty of two people who have found what they were looking for and know it. They were married in June of 1879 at the Caldwell Creek Church, on a Saturday morning when the weather was generous, and the cottonwoods were in full leaf, and the whole town came out because the whole town had been invested in this outcome since the October morning when Micah Monroe had stood up in the courthouse without being asked. And people in small towns in 1878, Wyoming paid attention to such things and believed in their resolution. Clara wore her good dress and her expression of serious approval. Henry wore his good shirt and spilled something on it before the ceremony was half over, and seemed genuinely unconcerned about this. Micah stood at the front of the church in a clean dark coat and looked at Louise walking toward him down the center aisle, wearing her best dress, which was not a proper wedding dress but was a pale cream color that suited her, and he thought that he had seen a great many landscapes in his years of riding through the West, and that none of them compared to this particular sight. Louise walked down the aisle alone, because she had no father present and needed no one to give her to anyone, having already given herself with the full deliberateness of a woman who understood what she was doing, and she walked with her back straight and her chin up and her eyes on Micah Monroe, and the expression on her face was calm and full and openly happy, which, for a woman who kept most of what she felt close to the surface of her face and not on it, was very nearly extraordinary. The Reverend said the words, and they said the words, and Micah put a ring on her finger and she looked at the ring and then at him, and her eyes were bright, and he thought that whatever he had come to Caldwell Creek looking for, consciously or not, he had found it. After the ceremony, there was a reception in the church hall that went on past supper time, with music from old Hector Reyes, who played the fiddle with the particular abandon of a man who felt that celebrations were not celebrated with sufficient frequency, and intended to remedy this whenever the opportunity arose. Louise danced with her children and with her new husband and with half the town, and the sound of her laughing carried out through the church hall doors into the warm June evening, the real laugh, the one she had been rationing, and she was not rationing it any more. At the end of the evening, when the children were drowsy and the musicians were packing up and the last neighbors were saying their good nights, Micah found Louise standing outside the church door looking up at the stars, and he came to stand beside her, and she leaned against him without calculation or restraint, just leaned against the solid warmth of him, and he put his arm around her. "What are you thinking?" he said. "I'm thinking that Thomas would have liked you," she said. "That's not a strange thing to say, is it?" "No," he said, "it's not. He was a good man who loved his children and wanted good things for them," she said. "He would have wanted this for us." She paused. "I carry him, I always will, but I think he'd have wanted me to have this." "I think you're probably right," Micah said. He pressed a kiss to her temple, gentle and sure, and she turned her face up to him, and he kissed her properly, in the warm June night with the fiddle music fading behind them, and the stars above the plains doing what stars above the plains always do, which is their own permanent and indifferent thing, that makes all the human brightness happening beneath them seem more precious for the contrast. The summer of 1879 was a good one. Micah took over the management of the ranch entirely, and proved to be as capable at it as he was at most things he turned his attention to, which was to say very capable and methodical about it. He was also not a man who needed to manage everything himself to feel that he had authority, which Louise had established early would be a requirement of any arrangement she was party to, and which Micah had understood immediately and genuinely. They made decisions together, at the kitchen table in the evenings with the ledger books open and the lamplight steady, and the ranch began to turn a real profit for the first time since before Thomas had taken ill. He also, with Louise's encouragement and a borrowed set of legal references, began taking occasional cases on behalf of people in Caldwell Creek who could not afford proper representation. This was not a profitable enterprise, but it was a consistent one, because there was no shortage of people in 1879 Wyoming who needed a thoughtful advocate and had no means of securing one. He charged what people could pay, which in some cases was a side of bacon or help with fencing, and he took those payments without condescension, and his reputation in the county grew to encompass both cattleman and the person you went to see when your circumstances had become legally complicated and you needed someone on your side. The first case he took after the Bell trial was a Mexican family named Ortega whose land grant had been challenged by a larger cattleman who believed he was entitled to use their grazing acres. The Ortega family had papers but no advocate, and the papers were old and complicated, and the cattleman had money and connections and a confident assumption that these things alone would settle the matter in his favor. Micah spent 3 weeks examining the original Spanish land grant documentation and researching the relevant territorial statutes, and he appeared at the county administrative hearing on the Ortega's behalf and laid out the case so thoroughly and with such precision that the land commissioner, who had clearly expected to rule the other way, found himself unable to do so in good conscience and ultimately did not. Mateo Ortega, who was 63 years old and had lived on that land for 40 years, shook Micah's hand afterward with both of his and said nothing for a long moment, and did not need to. Louise heard about this from Clara, who heard it from one of the Ortega grandchildren at school, and she said nothing to Micah about it that evening except that she was proud of him, and the look she gave him when she said it was the direct, fully attending look he had come to understand as the highest form of Louise's regard, the look that meant she was seeing him completely, and it meant more to him than a formal commendation. Fall came around again, the first fall anniversary of the courtroom, and Louise took the chain with Thomas's ring from around her neck and placed it in the small wooden box where she kept the few pieces of jewelry she possessed, and she left it there. She still thought of Thomas. She still would sometimes. But the grief had settled into the shape of a loss that had been fully mourned, something carried gently rather than with difficulty, and she thought Thomas would have approved of that too. In the winter of that year, she told Micah she was expecting a baby, and she told him on a Sunday morning in the kitchen with the snow falling outside and the children already at the table. And she said it quietly, just to him, and he looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, an expression of profound and slightly stunned joy, and he took both her hands in his and held them. And then Henry looked up from his oatmeal and said, "Are you two going to tell us what's happening or not?" Which made Clara look up from her lesson and made Louise laugh and Micah laugh, and even Henry, who had not quite understood what was funny, laughed too. They told the children after breakfast, and Henry's response was immediate and practical, announcing that if the baby was a boy he had a list of appropriate names. Clara's response was to look at her mother and then at Micah and then say, with the careful consideration of someone who has been composing their judgment for some time, "I think that's good." She looked at Micah when she said it. He nodded at her, seriously, acknowledging the weight of what she was granting, and she nodded back. The baby came in August of 1880, a boy, which was a matter of great personal satisfaction to Henry, who had indeed maintained his list of names and presented it with ceremony. They named the boy James Thomas Monroe, James because it had been Micah's father's name, and Thomas because it seemed right and true and a good way to hold together the things that had come before and the things that were being made new. James Thomas Monroe came into the world on a hot August night when the plains smelled of dry grass and the stars were enormous and the cattle were restless. He was a healthy and loud baby with dark eyes that looked immediately as though they were intending to pay close attention to everything. And when Micah held him for the first time, he stood in the lamplight of the bedroom with his son in his arms and thought about the chain of things that had brought him here. The road from Austin, the cattle drives, the bunkhouse at the Calhoun Ranch, the morning he walked into the back of the Harding County Courthouse and watched a woman sit down alone at a table and decide to fight. He looked at Louise, who was watching him hold the baby with an expression of complete and quiet joy, her hair loose and her eyes bright with the particular brightness of someone who has gone through something enormous and arrived on the other side of it. And he thought that he had never made a better decision in his life than standing up that October morning without being asked, and that he would go on making decisions like it every day, for as long as he was given to make them. Louise looked at Micah holding their son, and she looked at Clara on the chair in the corner with her composition book open, recording things because that was what Clara did, and at Henry asleep on the bench by the wall because Henry could sleep through almost anything and had determined that tonight was not an exception. And she thought about the ranch and the courtroom, and the winter and the spring and the summer and the year that had gone by since then. And she thought that grief and gladness were indeed not incompatible, and that she carried Thomas Bell's good memory as something light and worthy, and that the life she was living now was abundant and full and honestly earned, and that she was glad. The years that came afterward were the years of building, the ordinary, extraordinary years that do not have dramatic events attached to them, but in which the real substance of a life takes shape. Micah rode the cattle drives twice more over the following 3 years, and each time came back to the ranch and to Louise and to the children with a clarity of feeling about what he was returning to that made the return itself a kind of joy. He also formalized his legal practice, such as it was, by 1881 passing the bar examination in Cheyenne, which required him to be away for 2 weeks studying in the territorial capital, and which he found considerably less challenging than the examinations he had taken in Austin a decade prior, because he had spent the intervening decade reading law for pleasure in bunkhouses, and had not, as it happened, forgotten any of it. He came back from Cheyenne with the certificate in his saddlebag, and a box of penny candy for the children, and a small brooch for Louise that he had seen in the window of a jeweler's shop, and that had reminded him of her in a way he could not entirely articulate, which was the way the best gifts work. She wore it on her collar the following Sunday at church, and when he looked at her across the pew and she met his eyes, there was a warmth between them that required no words and that Clara noticed with the perceptive awareness of an 11-year-old who had become something of a connoisseur of her mother's expressions. By 1882, Micah had a modest but genuine law practice operating out of a small office he rented above the general store in Caldwell Creek, and he continued to work the ranch in the mornings and take cases in the afternoons and evenings. He represented farmers and cattlemen and settlers, and at least 2 Shoshone families, whose land rights had been complicated by recent treaties that had been applied inconsistently and often unjustly. And he did not pretend that the law was always just, but he believed it could be made more just through careful and stubborn application, and he applied it carefully and stubbornly. Louise, for her part, had become the person that certain women in Caldwell Creek came to see when they needed to understand their legal rights in matters of property or inheritance or the complexities of widowhood, because word had spread, as word does in small towns, that Louise Bell, who was Louise Monroe now, had once walked into a courthouse alone and held her own against a polished lawyer, and that she had a habit of knowing more than people expected her to know and explaining it in plain language. She took no money for these conversations. She offered them in the kitchen over coffee, practical and thorough, because she remembered what it felt like to sit alone at a table in a courthouse with a composition book and a pencil stub and no one on her side, and she had decided she could do something about that particular feeling for other women if she paid attention. In the spring of 1883, she told Micah she was expecting again, and this time they told the children at breakfast the same morning, and Henry, who was 12 now and had developed opinions about most things, said that he hoped it was a girl this time because he needed fewer brothers, a statement that made James, who was 2 and understood only that everyone was laughing, laugh also. Clara, who was 13 and had begun keeping a different kind of composition book that contained, in addition to natural observations, certain philosophical reflections of a personal nature, looked at her mother and then at Micah and said, "Good," with the decisive simplicity of someone who has assessed the situation and found it satisfactory. The second baby was indeed a girl, born in November of 1883, and they named her Eliza Jane Monroe. Eliza for no specific reason except that it felt right to both of them simultaneously when Micah said it aloud in the lamplight of the bedroom on the night she arrived, and Jane because Louise's mother had been Jane and had been a woman worth naming someone after. Eliza came into the world with the decisive noise of someone who intended to make her presence known, and she proved over the subsequent weeks to be very much like her mother in this respect, which was to say that she had opinions and she expressed them, and she was not interested in being managed. Micah looked at his daughter in those early weeks and looked at Louise and said, very quietly, "She's exactly like you," and Louise said, "I sincerely hope so," and the way she said it made him laugh with a fullness that came from somewhere deep and true. Clara, who had at first maintained the careful distance of a teenager assessing a new situation, fell comprehensively in love with her baby sister within approximately the first 48 hours, and was thereafter one of the primary advocates for Eliza's interests, a role she took with characteristic seriousness. Henry was fond of Eliza in the way of older brothers who believe the new family member is acceptable, and they are prepared to defend them if necessary. James, at 3, was uncertain about the new person but had been won over by spring. The Bell Ranch, which was now properly the Monroe Ranch, though Louise had insisted on keeping Bell in the land deed as a middle name of sorts, a hyphenation of history, had grown steadily and was by 1884 one of the more successful operations in Harding County. They had added 40 acres to the east, bought honestly from a retiring farmer who was moving to live with his daughter in Denver, and Micah had overseen the construction of a proper barn that replaced the patched and perpetually threatening to collapse original, and the house itself had been extended by 2 rooms to accommodate the growing family. Clarence Bell had left Caldwell Creek 6 months after the trial, as further investigation into the loan document confirmed the same suspicious characteristics as the letter, and he had not been heard from since in any official capacity. His departure was not mourned by anyone who had known the situation. On the 5th anniversary of the day Micah had stood up in the Harding County Courthouse, Louise set the occasion with the precision of a woman who remembers dates and the events attached to them. She did not make a formal occasion of it. Instead, in the evening after the children were in bed, she poured 2 cups of coffee and sat across the kitchen table from Micah and said, "Do you know what day it is tomorrow?" He looked at her over his cup. "October 14th, he said. 5 years, she said. He was quiet for a moment, and then he smiled, the full smile that she had catalogued alongside the particular angle of the October light and the sound of his laugh, and all the other things she had been collecting these 5 years without intending to. "I was terrified that morning," he said. She blinked. "You were terrified." "I stood up and I had no idea whether I was going to be thrown out of the courthouse, or whether you were going to refuse my help, or whether I was going to remember everything I needed to remember about paper mills and watermarks," he said. "My heart was going considerably faster than was comfortable." She looked at him with something that was fond and surprised and delighted simultaneously. "You looked completely calm," she said. "I have a useful face," he said. She laughed, and it was the full laugh, the one she had rationed once and no longer rationed, and it filled the kitchen the way it always did, and he sat across the table from her in the lamplight of their kitchen in their house on their ranch with their 4 children asleep in the rooms around them, and thought that if someone had told him, on the October morning he rode into Caldwell Creek with his bedroll and his copy of Blackstone and his general rootlessness, that this would be his life in 5 years, he would not have believed them, but he would have wanted to. "What were you thinking," he said, "when I stood up?" She considered the question seriously, the way she always considered questions. "I was thinking that I could not afford to trust anyone," she said. "And then I thought about what losing the case would mean, and what losing the case would do to my children, and I thought that you had the kind of eyes that a person either does not know how to lie with or has no interest in lying with, and that those 2 things are functionally the same and both of them were safer than the alternative." She paused. "And I thought you were rather handsome." He set down his cup. "You did not." "I did," she said. "I thought several very practical things and also one frivolous thing, and the frivolous thing was that you were handsome, and I stored it under inadmissible and proceeded." She looked at him with those direct, bright eyes. "I retrieved it later." He stood up from his chair and came around the table, and she turned in her seat to face him, and he crouched beside her the way he had crouched in the snow that January morning, eye level with her, and he took her hands in both of his. "Louise Bell Monroe," he said, "I stood up without being asked because something in me recognized you before I had any right to, and I have been glad of that every single day since." She looked at him for a long moment in the lamplight, this man with the dark eyes and the scar along his jaw and the Blackstone's commentaries in his saddlebag, and the habit of standing up for people who needed standing up for, and she thought about the October morning, and the courtroom and the composition book, and the winter and the spring and the summer and the 5 years, and the children sleeping in the rooms around them, and the years that were still ahead, and she thought that this was what love was in its fullest form. Not the falling, which was only the beginning, but the staying. The standing up again and again for each other and for the children and for the ranch and for the right thing in the large gestures and the small ones, through the winters and the summers, through the grief and the gladness. The daily, deliberate, wholly chosen act of it. "I am grateful," she said simply and completely, for the first and the truest time she had said it, "that you stood up." He brought her hands to his lips and kissed them, and outside the Wyoming plains were dark and enormous under the October stars, and the cottonwoods along the creek were yellow and brittle at the edge of another autumn, and somewhere in the rooms around them, their children breathed the particular easy breath of children who are safe. And inside the house there was lamplight and warmth, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was the whole world. In the years that followed, Clara Bell Monroe kept her composition books and eventually became the first woman from Harding County to attend the University of Wyoming when it opened its doors in 1887, carrying with her a series of filled composition books about the natural world, and a stubbornness about her own intelligence that she had inherited from her mother, and that would serve her extremely well. Henry Monroe became a rancher and a fair one, working a piece of land adjacent to the family ranch that Micah helped him purchase at 20. And he was a good neighbor and a good man who laughed easily and worked hard and thought of both Thomas Bell and Micah Monroe as his fathers in the fullest sense. James Thomas Monroe grew up with dark eyes that attended to everything and a methodical precision that his father recognized as an inheritance, and he eventually followed Micah into law, reading in his father's small office above the general store before going east to study properly, and coming back to Wyoming because Wyoming was home. Eliza Jane Monroe was, indeed, exactly like her mother, and the territory would know it in time. And Micah Monroe and Louise Bell Monroe lived the life they had built, on the Bell Monroe Ranch outside of Caldwell Creek, Wyoming, through the remainder of the beautiful and difficult and imperfect and remarkable century that was still going. And they were not perfect people living a perfect life, because perfect lives do not exist and perfect people would not have known what to do with Wyoming anyway. But they were two people who had found each other in the courtroom drama of an October morning and had chosen each other every day after that, through the winters and the open summers and all the changing light of the plains, and they were glad and they were together. And that was the story, and it was a good one.